Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Day of Defeat Source for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel of sorts to the original Day of Defeat, which was a mod that got turned into a full standalone game. It was developed by Valve and released first for PC in September of 2005, later on for Mac, and finally for Linux, and it was generally pretty well received, although there was the issue of when it was released, there really wasn't much content at all for the game, so it wore thin relatively quickly. But since then, they have put in some content patches, they've updated the engine to the more modern version of the Source engine that Counter-Strike Source runs on now, and of course a rather dedicated modding community has kept it alive through additional maps and such like that. But what I'm looking at here is really more the game in its base form, at least as base as I can get it, because there's basically no servers actually just running the base game anymore. It's pretty similar to Counter-Strike Source in that regard, where it's pretty much impossible to run into a vanilla server anymore, and instead you're going to find that pretty much all of the servers have at least some very slight modifications. So I of course did what I could with what I had, but what I had to work with here is basically just a total conversion of the original Day of Defeat with some gameplay tweaks. So the ultimate question with this game isn't so much, is it a faithful remastering of the original Day of Defeat, it's, are the changes they made to Day of Defeat Source compared to the original actually enough to justify the asking price? Let's delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as the presentation goes, obviously it's leaps and bounds ahead of the original Day of Defeat, because you're jumping from the Goldsrc engine to the Source engine, and with Day of Defeat Source, they actually introduced high dynamic range, which is actually kind of interesting because this was actually released before Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, and Lost Coast was supposed to be their big tech demo for HDR. So while it is certainly dated compared to what we get out of the Source engine these days, in 2005 this was actually kind of ahead of the curve, and what you end up with is a game that admittedly looks kind of dated by modern standards, but even if you look at it from that perspective, it still holds up surprisingly well. The animations aren't particularly good, but the texture quality is generally fairly solid, and the modeling itself is mostly pretty good apart from the character modeling here and there. And the environments themselves are actually rather well detailed, so the maps still pretty much hold up to this day, even though, again, the texture quality is not quite as good as we would hope these days. And despite the improvements they made by bringing it up to a more modern version of the Source engine, ultimately it definitely does scream that it was released in about 2005-2006. That's pretty easy to overlook though. What's slightly less easy to overlook are the sound effects and the music. While you don't really need to worry about the voice acting because it's just callouts over the radio like in, say, Counter-Strike, and there's no actual voice acting to speak of in the game other than the fact that the Germans speak German and the Americans speak English, you've got sound effects that are only occasionally decent. I mean, for example, the rifles don't really sound like proper rifles, none of the weapons sound particularly powerful so much as they sound generic. And that definitely does wear on you after a while. There's also a distinct lack of music. You have a theme that will play whenever you win or lose, but that's based on your faction, and it's a fairly short one. And you have the main menu tune, which is completely forgettable. So ultimately the sound design ends up being fairly mediocre overall. It's not terrible, but they could definitely have done quite a bit better than what they actually ended up doing. But of course what really matter here are the story, or rather lack thereof, because this is a multiplayer World War II shooter set in the European theater, so it's just you're playing as the Allies versus the Axis, and in particular you are playing as the Americans versus the Germans. There is no single player campaign of any sort, so you immediately have to hop online and just hope for the best. This introduces you to the two main game modes and the pretty much handful of maps that you're going to run into. The game modes are Territorial Control, which is your classic Day of Defeat mode, and Detonation, which is pretty much just like in, say, Call of Duty if you were playing Search and Destroy. Although I guess a better comparison would be Battlefield's Rush mode, because you don't have a single life on your spawn, so it's ultimately a mode of attack and defense. One team attacks, the other team defends. And it's pretty straightforward. The attacking team needs to destroy all the objectives before the time runs out, and of course the defending team is trying to prevent that. Here's the thing, the vast majority of people play the Territorial Control mode where you have to capture points scattered throughout the map. It's basically a domination mode. Although unlike other domination modes that you may be used to, you will find that sometimes a flag needs more than one player to be able to capture it, so it doesn't really encourage lone wolf play. And that's something that permeates the rest of the multiplayer as well, because this is actually a class-based game. You have 6 different classes that you can use in order to eviscerate your foes and complete your objectives. The most basic of these is your rifleman, which has a long-range rifle that can go into iron sights for precision shooting at long range, and they also get access to rifle grenades. There's also an assault class which has submachine guns, a support class which uses either an automatic rifle in the case of the BAR or an assault rifle like in the case of the STG-44. And of course there's also the anti-armor player who can use a bazooka or a Panzerschreck, which of course does massive damage, although it does mean that you move rather slowly when you're trying to use it. And of course you can be a sniper or a deployable machine gunner as well. And the idea is to mix and match these different classes so that they fit in well with what you're trying to do as a team. If you're trying to capture a certain point and it requires a lot more of the run and gun style, then you're probably going to end up with more of the support gunners and the assault class. Likewise, if there's a lot of long-range fire support needed, you're going to have a fair few snipers as well as a fair few riflemen. Or at least that's the idea, because if you try to play this thing, you'll find that the vast majority of people just run around and do their own thing. They'll pick a class that they like playing and they'll stick with it, and they won't really change to meet the situation at hand. And so if you decide to try to fill in the gaps by selecting whatever class the team really needs at that particular moment, you're going to find that each class has its own strengths and drawbacks. The high rate of fire weapons are generally much better for close quarters, whereas of course the slower firing weapons are better for long range. Which means that if you're a rifleman and you manage to get caught in CQB, you'd better hope that one of your machine gun wielding buddies is nearby to bail you out, because otherwise you're pretty much screwed. This is partly due to the fact that you really can't take very much damage in this game. I mean, for rifles in particular, if you get a good shot in with them, usually it's a 1 or 2 shot kill. Players are very, very squishy in this game, and it does not take much at all from the various classes to just wipe the floor with them. Where that starts to become a major problem is in the fact that this is a Source Engine game and it's pre-CSGO, and they didn't update it to the new hitboxes. This means that those wildly inaccurate hitboxes you saw in Counter-Strike Source are alive and well in Day of Defeat Source as well, and more often than not they can get pretty frustrating to deal with. It's a particularly annoying problem that the Source Engine was plagued by until more recent years, and they just never got around to updating the hitboxes in Day of Defeat Source, probably because there's really not as many people playing this as there used to be. Obviously that's to be expected considering the game originally came out in 2005, but at the same time it means that they didn't really have much incentive to update it, and thus you end up with that weird situation where the hitboxes are still borked and there's not really much you can do about it. And that ultimately means that Day of Defeat Source basically feels like a World War II version of Counter-Strike Source, but with class-based warfare instead of just running in and buying whatever weapons you wanted. That's of course excluding the game modes. I mean more in the fact of how it feels to move around, where you don't really move very fast, and if you get hit you pretty much stop in your tracks, which is pretty annoying. And there's also the fact that the weapon handling in this really isn't the best. The weapons themselves have quite a bit of recoil, and unless you're using the rifles, you're going to find that after only a few shots in a burst, you're pretty much aiming at the sky. Particularly if you're using the deployable machine guns and haven't actually set them up. The problem is that unlike in, say, Counter-Strike, where each weapon had its own specific recoil patterns and you could work around that, Day of Defeat doesn't really have that going on, and instead the shots are fairly random. This is why for the rifles in particular, it's usually best to aim down your sights for anything longer than a fairly short-range engagement, because if you don't do that, then you're probably not going to hit whatever it is you're trying to aim at. Of course, the problem with aiming down the sights is that you move at a snail's pace when you're aiming down the sight, and you have basically no situational awareness whatsoever, so it's pretty easy to get picked off. You may think that sounds balanced, and to some degree yes it is, but then there are the other classes to deal with, where this game really isn't all that balanced. This is why a lot of servers enforce a strict limit on the number of classes that are available for each team, usually limiting the rocket launcher people to 1 or 2 per team, and then there's the machine gunners who are usually limited to 1 or 2 per team as well. This is because, of course, those classes are ridiculously powerful, but also because camping is absolutely rampant in this game, and that's a sort of attempt to remedy that. Granted, camping was a pretty big problem in Counter-Strike and Counter-Strike Source as well, so it's really no surprise that it would permeate in Day of Defeat Source as well. And that's really one of the biggest problems with Day of Defeat Source. It's not that it's an outright bad game, it's just that it's a total conversion of the original Goldsrc version of Day of Defeat, with some slight tweaks here and there that really don't add all that much to the game. Sure, the enhanced visuals are nice, and it's nice being able to aim down your sights on your rifle at long ranges, but other than that, it really doesn't do all that much that the original Day of Defeat didn't do, and it does it with less content. The original Day of Defeat actually had the British in it, although I never managed to play as them myself, and in Day of Defeat Source, it's only the Americans and the Germans. Not to mention the fact that the game launched with a pittance of maps, and even after several patches for content, there really isn't all that much content in the game. The modding community, of course, did its best to pick up the slack, but that's really an excuse more than anything else. Sure, it's nice that the game can be modded fairly extensively, but at the same time, it's pretty much a crutch that this game has to stand on. That's not to say that the core gameplay is bad, it's just merely okay, and if you've played the original Day of Defeat, there's really not much reason to play this unless you're just wanting a graphical upgrade with some slight tweaks here and there. And if you've played Counter-Strike Source, then there's really not much reason to play this either unless you just really want a World War II shooter in the Source engine. And so ultimately, Day of Defeat Source ends up being a rather underwhelming experience. It's not an outright bad game, you can certainly get some fun out of it, but you have to kind of dig for that fun, and more importantly, you have to not have really been burned out on Counter-Strike or Day of Defeat. So I can really only recommend it to people who aren't burned out on Day of Defeat, people who just haven't played Day of Defeat before and can't stand to get into the original because, first off, it has a fairly low player base now, but also because it is rather dated at this point. And of course, it's a lot easier to get into Day of Defeat Source than it is to get into the original at this point. But the only other people I can definitely recommend it to are the people who already play it, the people who were big into the original Day of Defeat and just decided to move up to the Source version later on. But even then, if you go from the original Day of Defeat to this, you're going to find that it's a rather mixed bag, because on the one hand, the visuals are a lot better, and there's a few tweaks to the actual gameplay, but when you get down to it, the hitboxes are a lot worse, and the lack of content compared to the original is definitely a problem. The whole game just ends up feeling decidedly bare bones, and that's not really a good thing in this case. It ultimately ends up being just a rather hard game to recommend and an overall underwhelming experience, which ultimately nets it a 2.5 out of 5. Again, it's not an outright bad game, but I just can't recommend it. Thanks for watching.